Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff. In today's video, we are going to be talking about why your sublimation prints and projects are dull. If you are trying to make a sublimation project and it's coming out faded or the colors don't look great, we're going to talk about 14 or 15 different reasons why this might be happening. I do have some other videos that also go into troubleshooting when it comes to sublimation. So I have a basic troubleshooting sublimation video. I also have a video called ICC Profiles and Color Management if you're specifically worried about what you're doing with your color. And if your printer is clogged, I have a series of videos that can help you get your printer back to working properly. But in this video, we are going to specifically be talking about why your prints might be faded or dull. This is something I see a lot of people complaining about, and sublimation should be bright and vivid. So if you are experiencing prints that just don't look very good, hopefully one of the tips and tricks in this video will help you out. First, let's talk about the prints coming right out of the printer. I see this a lot for new sublimation people. The print coming out of your sublimation printer is going to look off. It's not going to look right. First of all, it is going to look very faded, and most likely the colors are going to look completely incorrect. And that's because with sublimation ink, you're not going to see the actual color that ink is until the sublimation process happens. And the sublimation process is actually when that ink is turned into a gas and applied to a project with a heat press. So basically that ink has to be heated up for you to see the actual colors that it's going to be. I'm going to throw a little photo up here, and you can really see in this photo how the print itself is very dull. The colors don't look right at all, but when I pressed it onto a garment, you can see it is bright and vivid. So if you are struggling because you're just looking at this print going, this looks nothing like I want it to look, go ahead and make sure you're putting it on a blank with a heat press. If you don't want to waste a blank, I highly recommend getting a piece of polyester fabric, just the cheapest polyester fabric you can find, bright white, and you can do a test print. So instead of wasting that tumbler or whatever blank you have, getting the wrong color or something that you're just not looking for, you can test your print on that fabric. Yes, you are going through prints a little bit faster because you're testing them, but that is way less expensive than going through blanks. So I have a huge sheet of polyester and I test almost everything that I print just because I want to make sure that it looks good before I put it on my final blank. Another problem you might encounter is with your print quality settings. So for the most part, you're going to want to select something like best or high quality, and that is because those particular types of processes actually put more ink down on the piece of paper, and more ink generally equals more vibrant projects. That being said, you can definitely test this. So there might be some blanks where the low quality, the draft, the standard setting works just fine. And there are some times where you actually don't want quite as much ink. So there are some blanks, and I honestly can't tell you, it's kind of one of those things where you're like, this is like the ink is sort of migrating, it's sort of moving out from its boundaries. Then you might have too much ink on your page and you may want to move to a more standard setting. Additionally, if you are having those dull prints, you may want to try changing your paper settings. So for the most part, I just print with the standard paper setting, but a lot of people have found that if you change your paper setting to matte, it actually creates a better print. And this is because of the same thing that I mentioned before. When you're using a matte piece of paper, you actually need to put more ink down on that piece of paper because the paper is going to soak it up versus the ink sitting on top of a glossy paper. So the printer knows to lay down more ink if you're using that matte setting. Even if you're just using a regular piece of sublimation paper in there, you can use that matte setting to get your printer basically to add more ink, and more ink generally equals more vibrant prints. Fourth, we can talk a little bit about image quality. So there is a saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if you are putting a garbage file in, you're going to get a garbage file on the other end. And a lot of times this happens because people just try and pull whatever image they want from the internet, and these are going to be low resolution. So the internet is basically working with 72 dpi, but for the prints that you want to do with sublimation, you really want something more like 300 dpi. Dots per inch, it basically means more ink, more pixels are being put down when you have that 300 dpi. I talked about this in a previous video, where to find good sublimation files. So when you are looking for sublimation files, you want to find those high-res files. Those generally come from people who have designed their files properly. I will go ahead and link to that particular video down in the description so that you can watch it. But you just want to make sure that you're having a high-quality file that is going into your print so that when you print it out, it actually looks good. One thing that a lot of people like to do with sublimation too is use old photos, and old photos in general can be really tricky. So the first thing you probably need to do is scan them in. So if you have the original photo, you want to scan it in at least 300 dpi. A lot of times old photos though are very small. So if you're scanning it in at 300 dpi, that's the size you can use it on whatever you're putting it on. So you couldn't put something that's this big on a shirt without blowing it up and sort of getting all pixelated. So if you are scanning in your own photos, I highly recommend scanning them in at 600 DPI or even higher. The photos may still look a little bit blurry just because old photos are not nearly as crisp as the photos that we have today. But if you are scanning them in at that higher DPI, you are going to have better luck than if you're scanning them in kind of at the same size that they actually are. Additionally, with old photos and images, you may see faded images because the image itself is faded. Over time, photos break down, they brown, they yellow, but there are places like Photo Glory online where you can go and actually change the quality of the photo. So maybe you have a very yellow photo. You can use the tools in that free software to actually fix the file, and the file should look a lot better when you print it out and sublimate it to whatever blank you're putting it on. Another small edit you might want to make has to do with contrast. So if you have a lot of mid-tones, you may want to bump the contrast up a little bit. It's basically going to make your darks darker and your lights lighter. And because you have more of a contrast, a lot of times that can look a little bit more vivid when it's actually pressed onto a blank. It's something that you may just want to mess with. Most photo editing software, all the free photo editing software should have a contrast button. But you may want to bump it up just slightly more than you think looks good on the screen, because a lot of times that brightness can't quite translate to the print itself. So you may just want to bump up the contrast a little bit more than looks good and give that a shot. Test it on that polyester fabric and see if it looks better. Okay, let's move on from sort of the files and printing options and talk about what we're actually using to print. Another thing that might cause these sort of faded images is if you are using a low quality or just not sublimation paper. So I did a test a couple of years ago at this point between using 5 different types of sublimation paper. And one of those things I tried was copy paper. And there was a significant difference between the copy paper and the best paper that I found. The best paper that I found gave me rich, bright colors when I transferred it to that polyester, whereas the copy paper left me with a much more faded image. So you might see people out there saying, yeah, you can totally use copy paper. You don't have to buy sublimation paper. But I found that there really was a very big difference. You may want to try a couple of different brands as well. A lot of people really, really like the A-Sub sublimation paper, but I actually found the text print worked really good in my particular printer, better than the A-Sub. So if you are having those faded prints or you just don't think things are quite vibrant enough, you can try swapping out your sublimation paper for a different brand because maybe it will just work better with your printer. And then number 7, speaking of paper, I have seen people print on the wrong side of their sublimation paper. So there is a specific side that you should be printing on. Most brands these days are putting a watermark on the back, makes it very easy to know which side you need to print on. But if your paper doesn't have a watermark, you can actually flip one piece of paper over and look for which side is a brighter white. Generally, the back side is going to have slightly grayish hue to it or maybe a slightly pinkish hue. You want that bright white side. That's the side you need to be printing on, because if you're printing on the other side, it's basically like using copy paper. And you really want to make sure that you're using the correct side so that you get the brightest print. Number 8 is using a low poly count or a no poly count. So basically, for the sublimation process to happen, you need to have either a polyester or poly-coated blank. If you're using a polyester garment or other soft textile, you want at least 65% polyester, because that polyester is what the sublimation ink will bond to. Any lower than that, and you are definitely going to have a faded image. Some people come to me and they're like, why does this look so bad? And it's because they used a 100% cotton shirt. There is nothing for that ink to bond with. So starting at 65, you are going to get kind of a faded image. It might look a little bit more vintage. 100% polyester, it's going to look great. Somewhere in between that, depending on the amount of polyester you have in your soft garment. So if you are struggling with getting your shirts or other garments to be really bright, check that polyester count and make sure that it's at least 65, even higher if you want a really, really vivid image. Then for hard blanks, you need some sort of poly coating. So there are sublimation suppliers out there who add this coating to different things. This includes tumblers and mugs and night lights and dog dishes and all sorts of different things that you can sublimate, but it has to have that poly coating, which means that you can't go to the dollar store and pick up a ceramic mug and expect to sublimate it. It doesn't have that poly coating, so again, there's nothing for the sublimation ink to bond with. So when you are looking for blanks to do sublimation with, go ahead and make sure that it's either a sublimation specific blank or it has that polyester count or that polyester coating, because without it, you just can't do sublimation properly. And then next up, you may just have a bad sublimation blank. The coating may just not be very good. So with the rise of at-home sublimation, there are countless brands on Amazon and other places that are selling blanks from overseas. And sometimes they just aren't very good. So generally, I would say buy from a reputable dealer. So some that I like D-Life, Cricut, HDD Ront. They generally make a lot of really good blanks. They have a big process. They're not trying to make 1,000 different things that aren't just sublimation supplies. They really have a niche. And so I would go with a more reputable company like that. There are some cheap brands out there that are just putting kind of crummy sublimation coatings on things. The sublimation coating may not hold that sublimation ink very well. Sometimes it flakes off. So if you can't seem to get one particular blank right, it's probably not you. It's probably the sublimation blank itself, and you may need to try something else. Next up, we have moisture problems. Moisture is basically the enemy of sublimation, and it can really ruin your projects. So before you press any of your sublimation prints, you want to make sure that you are drying out your sublimation blank. That can be done by either actually pressing it. I generally do that with soft blanks. If it's a hard blank, some of them I will just hover the heat press over. Like if it is something like a sublimation slate, I will hover my heat press over it for a good 2-3 minutes to really pull out all of that moisture. But you can also press it as well. If I'm doing a tumbler or something like that, sometimes I will just give it a quick press. You basically want to evaporate any moisture that is in your blank because it can really mess with your color. It can mess with how bright your image is. And if you're having faded images, moisture could definitely be a culprit. There is also the possibility of moisture in your print itself. So if you are printing something that is really heavy on color, you've printed it on that matte paper, and it's just holding a lot of ink, you don't want to press it until that ink is really dry. A lot of times you can sort of wiggle it back and forth and see whether or not it is shiny. If it's still shiny, it's not ready to press. You can also hover your heat press over that. So I was making some sublimation notebooks last year, and they just were really, really ink-heavy prints. And so I basically put it on the base of my heat press. I held the heat press above it, and within 10 seconds, it had really dried out that ink and I was ready to press. Next, we're going to talk about time and temperature. So these could be a very big culprit. If you are having issues, time and temperature is honestly a really great place to start. A lot of blanks will have like the suggested time and temperature from the manufacturer, but I'm going to give you an example that I did. You can go back and watch. I have 2 videos. I have one on sublimating different blanks from Michaels, and I have one on sublimating glitter blanks. With the Michaels blanks, I only had 1 glitter mug, and I used their time and temperature recommendations, and it almost didn't sublimate at all. I could see just around the edge where it was trying, but my time and my temperature were both way too low for this particular blank. So then in the glitter video, I tried it again, and I literally had it in there for like 8 minutes versus 60 seconds or whatever Michaels thought I needed. And because I had that much longer time, it sublimated beautifully. You can also see an example of this in my video about sublimating slate with an AutoPress. So the AutoPress doesn't quite have the same amount of pressure as other presses. And because of that, you need to really fuss with that time and temperature on those variables a little bit more. And you can see this example here that I started with a much more faded image and worked my way, adding time, adding a little bit of temperature to a much better image. And then also note that you can overcook a project. So if you have made something and you're like, this looks a little weird and faded, if your blacks particularly are kind of brown or everything looks a little bit yellow, you have probably overcooked your project. So there is a way to get faded images if you have too little time, as well as having faded images if you have too much time or temperature. And then I mentioned pressure as well. Pressure is one of those things that is also really important for sublimation. You need firm, even pressure. And if you don't have that, a lot of times you can end up with faded images and other problems. Most sublimation blanks just require medium, firm pressure, and you can do that with something like a handheld press like a Cricut Easy Press. But there are a handful of projects that really need heavy pressure. I mentioned slates before. Generally, I need a lot of pressure to get slates done really well. So if you are using something like a Cricut Easy Press and a blank like a slate and you're like, I just can't get a good image, it might be because you can't get quite the right amount of pressure for that particular project. And then number 13 kind of goes with it, and that is uneven pressure. So if you are using something like a Cricut Easy Press and you are just, without even knowing it, putting more pressure on one side, you can end up with an image that is much more vivid on one side and a little faded on the other side. You also want to make sure that your table is very flat, because if your table is tilted at all, that can really mess with your pressure, especially if you're using a handheld press. Then there's also a chance that your press has some cool spots or some warm spots. Generally, most presses shouldn't, but if you're using an older press, and one of the circuits goes out or something, you may be like, why is this side of my project sort of faded and the other side looks really good? Maybe it's just not getting enough heat to that platen and it's causing problems for you. And then finally, number 14, 15, I don't even know what number we are on at this point, you may see some fading due to double pressing. So if you are making quite a large project and it's bigger than your heat press, you're going to need to press it in sections. And you really do need to overlap that just a bit so that you don't have a weird line in the middle, right? But sometimes that overlap can be faded, and that is because you've sublimated it once, it's perfect, and then you're putting more heat on it. And a lot of times it will resublimate that ink, and that ink will sort of migrate back out of the fabric, and you will basically end up with a faded strip. So there's no real way around this because you do need to double press projects like that. We all can't have, 20-inch heat presses in our home, but some blanks are way worse than other blanks. So if you're really struggling with a blank, maybe just try a different type of blank for these big projects, because sometimes it's just not, there's no way to work around it. And you just need to be like, okay, that's not going to work for me. I need to do something else. All right, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have dull sublimation prints that you want to make very bright. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate a like. Follow my channel for more crafty content. I'll see you next time.